everyone, and welcome to World War II Above and Below, presented by Pursuit Picks Media. My name is Mitchell Babarovich, joined by my co-host Sam Allen, and today's topic is our top 5 World War II movies. Doesn't necessarily make, not like films, like outstanding pieces of cinema, but we wanted to look at top 5 movies that are excellent representations of the subject regarding the Second World War. So this it's going to be controversial no matter what. But I think Sam and we haven't shared each other's lists, but we got 5 movies with 3 honorable mentions, and we'll go through these as quickly as possible. We'll just bounce back and forth off of each other. In no particular order. I think it more so has to do with a movie that represents a certain theme or theater really well, where if somebody asked about, what would be a good movie on, insert, subject, and you would reply with, whatever,
it doesn't have to be the best film, the best World War II movies. It's just it's their specific topic, their specific period in time or event or what have you.
Yeah. And so let's jump into it. We have not shared each other's list. Sam will start us off with his first one on his top 5 list.
Yeah, so it's one that you've heard me talk about a lot, and it's Dunkirk, but it's the 1958 version.
Okay.
It's got John Mills, Dickie Attenborough, Bernard Lee. It's the reason I prefer it to the modern Dunkirk is because it doesn't just cover the evacuations. It starts before the German invasion into the West, I'd say only briefly, and it also covers on the home front. It covers John Mills, who plays a corporal, in his section, and it's a great expanse of that whole time period, those couple of weeks in 1940, rather than just the modern Dunkirk, which I think is very limited and doesn't really go into much depth. I think that's the advantage this one has. Its depth, and the effects look fairly convincing for the time. So I think for that period of the war, it's Dunkirk. It's Dunkirk from 1958 for me.
Okay. So that's Sam's first one. My first one is probably one that a lot of people would have on their list. Try to get one about the Holocaust, it would be Schindler's List. The Steven Spielberg absolute. What can you say about Schindler's List that hasn't already been said?
Yeah,
probably one of the first World War II films shown to. Basically, once you get into your teenage years, I do recall some of the history classes at my middle school seeing this in like 7th or 8th grade, just before high school. So my selection for the representation of the Holocaust would be Schindler's List. Another, I thought about the Pianist with Adrian Brody, the Roman Polanski movie, and that's a excellent film. But the Holocaust encompasses so much as opposed to the Pianist, which specifically follows one guy, and Spielman, the Pianist, obviously. But Schindler's List is my the first one on my top 5, and this is in no particular order. We just are putting together 5 films. So Schindler's List.
Agree with that.
Yeah.
So for me, it's another John Mills film, Ice Cold in Alex. It's a North Africa film. I was going to say it's John Mills, Sylvia Sims, Anthony Quayle, Harry Andrews. It's 4 people just going through the desert trying to make it back to Alexandria from Tobruk. It's that simple, and they encounter various things along the way. And there's, if you haven't seen it, I'm not going to spoil it. There's just some, how to phrase it. There's some espionage going on. I won't say more than that, but it's a part spy thriller, part survival thriller. So it's just a very nice sit down, relax, and it gets all the history right. You believe that they're stranded in the desert, and it pulls no punches. So that's one of my favorite films.
Well, and I want to pull
Personally, and go on.
and no, I just want to pull in a sidebar real quick. So the 1950s, for the war movie genre, a lot of the films that came out of Britain aren't appreciated enough
Yeah.
by war movie watchers. So you've listed Dunkirk, Ice Cold Alex, and then another one that's really good is Carve Her Name with Pride. I don't know if you're familiar with that one.
Forgotten about that
right?
one, yeah.
And then there's several movies like that come out in that 50s period where the UK is still feeling the effects of World War II. It's especially through rationing, right? Because I think rationing lasts until 57, 58.
53, I think.
Okay.
No. You might be closer to
the mid 50s.
Yeah, it's about then. Yeah,
but how it's, I mean, obviously America went through it. But we did not. We had the luxury of truly being an ocean away, and other than some balloon bombs and submarines, we were very distant from the war. But for the UK, it was personal, and that's the one thing I find interesting about these films that to come out of Britain in that 1950s, early 60s decade. Is how truly personable the war was for you guys, in which we serve is another one.
Yes, I was going to say there are
several.
Buckets. I was going to say the 1950s because also it's still a predominantly black and white film era as well, which I think lends it that authenticity.
Absolutely.
I was going to say it definitely ingrains you in the film, and then most of the time they're not the big ensemble cast pieces that you normally see. So they're very down to earth, simple, realistic films.
Yeah,
and I'd sort of get why they're not appreciated as much, but they deserve more.
Yeah, very character driven, not so heavy on the showing of the war aspect.
Definitely,
But it shows you people in absolutely horrendous conditions and how they behaved. And that's something that unfortunately doesn't get emphasized enough by not necessarily filmmakers. I would put it more on viewers because they want to see, they want to see airplanes. They want to see rifles. They want to see, and the human element certainly gets overlooked. And speaking of the human element, this next film that I chose, and it's the only movie poster that I have so far in my house. It is Das Boot. So 1981's Das Boot by Wolfgang Petersen, who just passed away within the last year or two.
Oh, did he?
Yeah. The best submarine movie ever made, for sure. Sorry, Hunt for Red October fans. But the Battle of the Atlantic is even though it's pretty much decided by May 42, June 42, maybe sooner or later than that. But it's the only campaign that goes from September 39 until May 45. In Europe, that is.
Yeah, in my opinion, it shouldn't be called the Battle of the Atlantic because that makes it seem much smaller than it actually was.
Right.
This is millions of tons of shipping being lost, thousands upon thousands of lives being lost. It's a war in itself, and I don't know why or how. I assume it's a Churchill thing why it got called the Battle of the Atlantic. But I don't. It shouldn't still be called that, in my opinion.
And so Das Boot, I think, is the best representation of that because it's the period of time that it covers is right at the end of the Germans kicking ass, where the Brits are starting to catch on and turn the tide, and it's just before the Americans get involved in December of 41. But it takes a very honest look at the Kriegsmarine, but also examines the conditions within the confinement of a submarine that I think any nation, naval personnel would have faced. And so Das Boot is my next movie on the list for that.
And so because even though the Germans were most famous for their submarine warfare, every single nation involved in the war had at least one submarine. There wasn't a nation, apart from the landlocked ones, that didn't have any submarines. And it's exactly the same. The conditions are exactly the same for every single submariner. And so even though it's about a German U-boat, it can easily apply to everyone else.
Yeah. So that was my nod to, and not just submarines, but also just the naval side of the Second World War in general, not pertaining just to Battle of the Atlantic.
Well, sticking with a sort of naval theme, I went with Tora 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 from 1970.
Okay.
And so it's, I think out of all the films we've had about Pearl Harbor, it's the most accurate. And it does do a very good job. There are problems with it, not going to lie. Sure. But I think for a balanced and in terms of a spectacle, it's Tora Tora Tora, because you've got both the Japanese and the American side shown. And I'm pretty sure the Japanese scenes were directed by a Japanese director as well, weren't they? Yeah,
they were. It was, I think it was multiple directors, including Kurosawa, did a couple of scenes. Very, very faithful and also respectful depiction of the Japanese. They're not just, cardboard cutout bad guys like you see, obviously during the war, shortly after the war, and then, because those were propaganda pieces, right?
Exactly. And sadly, that propaganda did sort of enter people's minds as a accurate representation, whereas it wasn't. They are just people. Yes, they were especially the Japanese army had a very horrific bloody streak about it, but most of them still are people.
Yeah, it avoids that othering that you see, which obviously not in that, you're fighting a war. They're going to do that. They're going to other the bad guys into something that's not a human being. So when you're trying to get the country behind your cause, you can see why they would do that, whether it's right or wrong. Obviously, it was wrong.
Yeah.
In the sense of like the racism that was really, really built up within that, especially here in the States with, they had the Coke bottle lenses and their yellow monkeys and stuff like that. But Tora 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 shows a different side of that. And and that's also the next one on my list as well.
So is it?
Yeah, sure is. Because I wanted to have at least something that represents the Pacific.
Yeah.
And I think that's, if I had to have one movie represent the Pacific Theater, that would be it. Although I do have another one in my honorable mention, which we'll get to after the completion of our top 5 list. So Tora 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 for both of us. So what do you got for number 4?
So I actually do have another Pacific one, and it's actually one from this century.
Okay.
It's 39th Battalion. That was the Australian name. Kokoda.
Okay. I have heard of Kokoda. Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah, it's a brutal movie.
It's horrible, isn't it?
Yeah.
So for those who don't know, it covers the 39th Militia Battalion of the Australian Army in the early days of the war in New Guinea through the Kokoda campaign.
Yeah, 1942.
Yeah, brutal film. Doesn't pull punches. I'm pretty sure it's probably the highest rated in terms of certification on the list. Just how horribly brutal it is. I'm pretty sure you only see like a couple of officers. It's mainly from your average rifleman's perspective.
It's a squad level representation. And that's an excellent film. One thing, so we just got done talking about Dunkirk and emphasize the importance of England.
Yeah.
Australia is the Pacific equivalent to that. Australia was basically the launching pad for every, the very foundation of operations in the Pacific. So you could not let Australia fall. And it came close, right? I mean, so Papua New Guinea is not very far at all from from this, and that's where the Kokoda track is, right?
It leads from
Okay.
the north coast to the south coast to Port Moresby, which is the main port and town on the whole of the islands, and that falls Australia's wide open. Because at that point in the war, there's only, I think, 2 American divisions in the whole theatre.
Right. Yep.
And that's including in New Zealand as well.
Yeah.
But you've talked about Australia being a launching pad, but the amount of militarization Australia did during that period. I mean, altogether, they raised about 15 divisions, which from a very small population is an incredible amount.
Yep.
The RAAF expanded massively. The Royal Australian Navy is, although we lost a good few ships, including some heavy cruisers, a heavy cruiser and a couple of light cruisers. At the end of the war, they have aircraft carriers, which for a small nation like that is absolutely mind-boggling. They race 3 armoured divisions, although only one of them sees action. So Australia is incredibly important to the war in the Pacific, in the southern part of the Pacific anyway, through New Guinea and then on to Borneo.
Yeah, that's also the first American land victory, too, in World War II.
Yeah.
Yeah, or the first that the Americans take part in. I mean, they didn't win it because, just as the Americans. But
exactly, and further east of Kokoda, at Milne Bay, is also the first defeat of the Japanese during the war.
Yeah.
And so it's an incredibly important theatre, which I think it's only that film covering New Guinea has been made. I think that's the only one, isn't it?
Yeah, could be the only one that I would recognize. Good pick, Sam. God, I did not expect that one. Yeah, and that's available on YouTube. It came out about 15, 20 years ago, and it's good. It's low budget, but I don't. You can see it. I don't know if that was filmed on location, but
it was I know it was definitely filmed in New Guinea.
Okay.
But I don't know if it's on the Kokoda Trail.
That's close enough. We're going to say it's filmed on location, because that had to have been a brutal shoot, and it shows, because those conditions were absolutely shitty. Yeah. So that's a great pick.
Papua hasn't changed since 1941.
Yeah. God, that's a great pick. Okay, so that was number 4, right?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Is it?
Yeah, it should be your number 4. Okay. So there was a coin toss on this one, and the one that I did not choose did not make it into honorable mentions, but I will bring it up since it competed with this one. You got to have something that represents the foot soldier, and I wanted. The only reason I chose this one is because it represents multiple countries, and that's A Bridge Too Far. I think that's it. It gives, and we've talked about this before on our Netherlands 44 series, where we covered A Bridge Too Far, but infantry, airborne, signals, it covers your platoon, company, or at least your company, your battalion, your regimental, and then your division level commanders.
It's the exact same as me. It almost made it onto the list, but we've already done it, so...
Yeah, it Bridge Too Far gives you a little bit of everything in terms of what it would have been like to serve in an armored or infantry unit during the Second World War.
Yeah, definitely.
So, and again, I think it's the best World War II movie that covers the Western Front. Mm-hmm. I really do think that. I
completely agree.
So that's my number 4.
So number 5 for me is this isn't going to be a surprise to anyone. Battle of Britain, 1969. Okay. It's just, in terms of historiography and how, especially during the latter part of the Battle of Britain, it still seems in the film like Britain has no chance other than plucky Brits in Spitfires and a few Hurricanes. But in terms of spectacle, in terms of how it looks, and in terms of the first half of the film of setting it up, of the situation in Europe, I think it does a brilliant job in that. And it's just a great film. It's action-packed.
And like A Bridge Too Far, it gives you scale. It gives you scale of how big of a battle that was.
and you also see lots of staff officers and senior officers, and that and that to me shows that it's not just the pilots who are winning the battle as well.
Yeah.
Because it is also all the the staff officers, those who are manning radar sites, the Royal Observer Corps, the ACAC batteries, the firemen, the balloon corps. It covers everyone. The only people it doesn't cover, sadly, though, is Bomber Command, because they played a pivotal role in the Battle of Britain. So that's one of my only two critiques of it. But as a whole, it's just a brilliant film.
Yeah,
I can't rate it highly enough.
Good choice. Solid choice. That's available on YouTube, I'm pretty sure, too. People need to go watch that.
Yes.
So I neglected to mention the film that competed with A Bridge Too Far. Similar to a lot of the films that Sam and I talked about that came out of the UK in the 1950s, America had a couple of movies that came out post World War II within that late 40s through the 50s timeline, and a lot of them were very propaganda pieces. One that was not, and probably the first significant World War II movie to come out after the war, was Battleground. So that's competed
on my honorable mentions.
Okay, that competed for A Bridge Too Far, because I wanted, you got to have at least one that represents, I think, at least one that represents the foot soldier's experience, and I think that movie, next to another one on my honorable mention list, is the best to come out within that 15 to 20 years after the war. So anyways, that was my one that competed with A Bridge Too Far, and I ultimately went with A Bridge Too Far.
Yeah.
So
okay. It's a very raw film.
Oh yeah, for sure. And basically created all the tropes that you see.
Yes, it really did.
When it comes to war movies. So my number 5, I wanted to represent the Eastern Front. Again, another coin flip between two. I went with the one that's probably a little more well known, and that is Come and See.
I haven't seen that. I've been avoiding it.
Yeah, it's brutal. I mean, I'm pretty sure it's got an NC-17 rating in the United States, which is worse than R for those unfamiliar with our MPAA ratings here in the States. But Come and See, again, we talk about, America went through it, Britain went through it, the Russians, the Ukrainians, I mean, that Eastern European side really went through it. The Polish went through it, and I think that film represents experiences that were not uncommon from people who lived in that part of Europe.
It's just the true horror of an ideological war, because you don't see much of the ideological side of the war in the Western theatre to some extent, but in the East it is ideological and racial from the German point of view, and so that creates horrors which are almost beyond imagining.
And I think when it comes to historical films, people who are interested in history will have, I think we've all have that list of what you have to watch. And that is certainly one of those that would make the list for me. And as much as I love A Bridge Too Far, I wouldn't put A Bridge Too Far on that list. I would put, movies like Come and See and Schindler's List on that. And Come and See is something all you need to do is watch it once. It's not something you need to sit through multiple times. But that is that's my Eastern Front representation on the top 5. So that's our top 5. So let's go ahead and hit honorable mentions. Why don't you just run down your list?
Yeah.
So there's 3. Each of us have 3.
Well, already done Battlegrounds. Exactly the same as you. It's just such a raw. It's such a, I think, accurate depiction for your average foot slogger. And say, I'm not going to go over what you've already said, but that's one of my honorable mentions.
If people want to know what the synopsis is of Battleground, it's the 101st Airborne during the Battle of the Bulge. Yeah, and it's it was written by a guy who served in the 35th Infantry Division during World War II, fought in Belgium, directed by a guy who was a fighter pilot in World War One. And then most of the extras that you see, there's about 25 to 30 extras that served in the 101st Airborne. And then the military advisor that they got for that movie was Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, who I believe commanded the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. That's the unit that they follow in Battleground. And Harry Kinnard, I believe, is the one who had the conversation with Anthony McAuliffe, who was the acting division commander in the 101st Airborne, where the Germans offered their surrender. And he's like, what do I tell him? And he goes, just tell him nuts, sir. And he goes, I think I'll tell him nuts. So, and that famous line of from the American commander to the German commander, nuts, and
the legendary line.
Yeah. So Battleground, that's a excellent film.
Don't say that's in the similar vein to my next honourable mention, which is Theirs Is the Glory.
Yep.
So Theirs Is the Glory. It's made in 1946.
It's right after the war.
Yeah, I think it just missed out of 1945. 1946. It's the 1st Airborne Division in and around Arnhem and Oosterbeek. You've got most of the extras are paras who were there. Well, the ones who survived. I'm pretty sure Freddie Goff plays himself, the Jeep Squadron commander.
Yeah, and then I think Lonsdale from Lonsdale Force is in it. Shot on location, by the way.
Yes, I forgot to mention that. And also, I want to say one of the brigadiers plays himself, but I can't remember for sure. But it's a very... Because it mainly follows, apart from those few moments where you see these senior officers, again, it's another one of those boots on the ground. And obviously, I think for Arnhem and Oosterbeek, it's the most accurate compared to A Bridge Too Far.
Yep.
Yeah. And I mean, don't get me wrong, we've talked about this. They get most of the things absolutely perfect. But I think what does it for this movie is that you get more of Oosterbeek.
Yep.
It's not just Sean Connery sat in a cellar somewhere.
Sure.
Or Laurence Olivier trying to get medical help.
Because they focused on the village that allowed them, to give a much deeper dive, and everything that you see in that movie. I mean, there's no doubt that's all. I mean, when you talk about movies being 100% accurate, that movie is 100% accurate.
Exactly. I don't think any other film has done that, where there's no doubt that there's nothing incorrect about it. Yep. I don't think there are many films who can claim that.
That's available on YouTube, and I don't think it has a copyright. So we'll have to have an episode where we just basically do like a Mystery Science Theater and sit down and watch it and provide commentary on it. That'd be a lot of fun.
Gladly.
To do. So that's your number 2.
My last one is a film which no one is going to have heard of.
Okay.
It's called Goodnight, Mr. Tom, and it covers an evacuee who goes to live with a grumpy old man in the country. And this evacuee's had a horrible life, living in the slums of London. And the old man, played by John Thor, he's lost his wife, lost his child, and he's a bit of a recluse, and they bond. That's the premise of the film, but it goes into deeper about, the life of an evacuee, the home front of the war, all that sort of stuff, and how the war is affecting people in this quiet little village in, oh God, I can't remember where it is now. Somewhere in the country, in the home counties.
Good night, Mr. Tom. Okay, yeah, I definitely.
It's on YouTube as well.
Okay,
and so definitely worth a watch.
Okay. So my top 3. I think part of the reason I chose Tora Tora Tora, it's one is an American. Obviously, Pearl Harbor is a significantly, historical date within our own history. Obviously, for World War II as well. Now, I did toy with the idea of including this one instead because the action or the timeline is the same, and that is Empire of the Sun.
Oh, of course, yes.
Empire of the Sun. I think if people made the top 10 Spielberg movie list, unfortunately, Empire of the Sun probably doesn't make it into that list, but shot on location. And China, I mean, almost, they either exceeded or it's close to lost as many people as the Soviet Union during World War II, and began
went on longer.
Right, went on a lot longer. I think 1931 is when is that
well,
when that started?
This is the debate. So the Japanese invade Manchuria in 1941, and there's a lot of border fighting. There's also Japanese landings throughout this part of the 30s on the East Coast. But it properly kicks off with the Marco Polo incident in 1937. I think June 1937.
Yeah. And I know in the early 30s, tensions got really, really bad between Chiang Kai-shek and the Japanese, and I think as early as 1931, maybe even before that or a couple years after that, right around that early 30s time period. But Empire of the Sun dives into a part of World War II that really hadn't been looked at on film. And that was one of the first Western films to be shot in China. So Empire of the Sun, and also allows an opportunity to look at life in a prisoner of war camp, internment camp. So that's my honorable mention. So the air war, this one didn't make the list because Tora 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 gives you plenty of air war action. 12 O'Clock High. So based on the book by Cy Bartlett and Bernie Lay Jr., both of those guys served in the 8th Air Force. Both of those guys were screenwriters and delivered an excellent book, an excellent film. Went on to be adapted into a series in the 1960s, and is I think in some ways you could say that's kind of the All Quiet on the Western Front in terms of like World War II. Books. If you need to what's a good novel from so and so country during this this time period, and 12 O'Clock High gets mentioned a lot in conversations like that. So the other film that competed for the Eastern Front representation was a flick that came out in the either the late 2000s or the early 2010s, and it's the most recent film on my list of all of these, and that's Brest Fortress.
Oh yeah,
and it's available on YouTube. Yeah,
with
English subtitles.
It's a long film, I remember.
Yeah, it's over 2 hours,
3 hours.
Yeah. And it shows the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, and when Hitler broke his pact with Stalin. But shows you what it would have been like to be an infantryman in that battle, what it would have been like to be a civilian, and unflinching, doesn't pull any punches, and come and see, watch it once, get it out of the way. I think it's important as a Westerner to watch that and to remember, like come and see, to not forget that there was a whole other front that really went through it, and like China, suffered more than 20 million. I mean, we'll never know exactly how many they lost between the Soviet Union and China, but it's a very unrelenting film and an excellent film.
I remember that being, firstly, you've got your action-packed side of it. There's no shortage of that, but there is also the human elements of that film, and also what it's like to live in a communist dictatorship as well, which obviously is a horrific prospect.
So, tear up your cards if you had Saving Private Ryan on our list. I think if we were doing a top 5 war film, Saving Private Ryan would have to be on there, whether you love it or hate that movie. It's a benchmark when it comes to storytelling, telling of war films. But when it comes to the subject, of faithful representation to World War II. I think it kind of has it has a little too much Vietnam-ish perspective to
The
it.
anti-war sort of
Well,
thing.
and not even necessarily anti-war. It's more so anti-establishment bureaucrat behind the desk is why we're
Okay,
here.
yeah.
1990s guys from the East Coast trying to play guys in the 1940s. it's and Saving Private Ryan is one big trope salad.
Exactly, yeah.
And
I think that's...
Go ahead,
Go
Sam.
on.
Go ahead, please. No.
I was just
Go
going to
ahead,
say
please.
that I think that's the reason why we both haven't included it, is because they're more concerned with the tropes. They're more concerned with getting a large audience. They're more concerned with being entertaining more than informative. Because don't get me wrong, there are some very nice scenes in it. Like, for example, when Captain Miller's been given that, I can't remember who it was, but his regimental commander, whoever, that debriefing of when they go try and take out those, what are they, 88s or whatever.
Yeah.
That scene, it's like, you believe he's a company commander. You do believe it because he knows what he's talking about. But then there's other scenes where he's just very unofficerly like, and they're only... It feels like when making the film, they're only playing for the money and for grandeur, if that makes sense.
Sure. I just, none of them, a lot of those guys were not very Ranger-like to me. And I just felt like it was no different from, the way they showed the characters was no different from a lot of like 1990s, early 2000s action movies where there's a lot of wisecracking assholes. And I just, the whole, because one thing that they emphasize in that, they try to emphasize when in reviewing that movie, when like people involved in that production, they talk about the brotherhood and the bond. And I gotta tell you, there really wasn't.
No,
they didn't really stake that landing. There's moments for sure, but when one guy turns around and calls the other guy an asshole, and they're playing guys from 1944, it's like, God, I've read a lot of like this. It fell off my desk, but anyways, I have a first edition of Devils in Baggy Pants, which I used as reference material for my short film Black Hearted Devils. That book was written 2 years after the war, so it's a very, very fresh account. And there were guys who were wisecracking assholes, but nobody. There weren't a lot of like
shot someone else.
There wasn't a whole lot of. Fuck you. It wasn't. There was no real anti-establishment. They understood for the most part, they understood the cause. They all trained together. They understood that if a guy cracked under pressure, they didn't have to sit there and berate him. It was just his, time, and he couldn't go on. Whereas in Saving Private Ryan, it's a little too modern.
This is what boggles me is Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks do Saving Private Ryan, and then they go on to do Band of Brothers, which is the complete opposite.
Well, so I think the reason for that is this: Saving Private Ryan is a composition of several accounts thrown into one, where there's nobody real in the movie other than George C. Marshall. Band of Brothers, there's no, as far as I'm aware, there's no composite characters. There's no fictional characters. And they made sure to stick faithfully to the source material. And I think that's Saving Private Ryan without, we never would have gotten Band of Brothers without Saving Private Ryan. I mean, that's just fact that's the reality of the situation. And I like Saving Private Ryan. I don't love Saving Private Ryan, but without Saving Private Ryan, I don't know what film would have created this benchmark for standards and a barometer of how we look at war movies.
I'm saying Saving Private Ryan is basically it's a break. It's a break between the shitty movies from the 90s and the late 80s. it's also a break from the old way of doing films from the 60s, the 50s, the late 40s.
Yeah.
And it leads into the early 2000s and the more modern, I don't want to say gritty, but more... It's more focused on an emotional sense rather than any gain or objective or event. It's predominantly always driven by a emotional human side.
Well, and so the idea for Saving Private Ryan came from, I think, Hanks and Spielberg reading a couple different Ambrose books, the two big ones being D-Day, the climactic battle of World War II. That's where they got the Omaha Beach stuff. And then everything else that came after that is from the follow-up to that book that Ambrose wrote called Citizen Soldiers. And if you flip through Citizen Soldiers, you'll see the references to like an infantry officer being back behind the lines, and you see guys having bacon sandwiches and they're on their typewriters. That's, you get a lot of that reference. And it's just the screenwriter, Robert Rodat, basically was like, here's a little bit of this on the plate and a little bit of that, which is fine. If you want to serve it up cafeteria style, fine. I think, and I don't blame Spielberg for making the movie the way he did. The issue more so falls on to the people who take that movie at face value as this like definitive document representation of that era. And it blew up into something what I don't think they expected it to be.
Exactly. I was going to say it's like a cult classic, but the cult is massive.
Yeah, it's something that everybody's... I mean, even people who aren't into World War II have seen Saving Private Ryan or some part of Saving Private Ryan. But I think the problem was created by people, and Band of Brothers has this a little bit too, right? I mean, if you're so invested into something, you tend to forget other elements of the larger part of the subject, and that's kind of the problem that Saving Private Ryan had, and that wasn't something that was on their agenda when they made that movie. It's on the fault of people who watched that movie and then I'm not going to say put their own spin on it, but got their own agenda out of it.
Yeah, it's your Wikipedia historians. I think that's the best way to put it.
Yeah,
but well, who knew this would turn into from best war movies to shitting on Saving Private Ryan?
Yeah, well, we'll have to have a separate podcast about. We don't hate Saving Private Ryan by any stretch, and I'm not one of those guys that's gonna jump on it necessarily for like historical accuracy or anything like that. I just think it's taken on this. There's a line in Family Guy from 15 years ago where Peter talks about not liking The Godfather because it insists upon itself. and then if you think about that with like Saving Private Ryan, it insists upon itself that this is the greatest war movie ever made. And I think that narrative has been created by people who have seen that movie several times and are still caught up in the nostalgia 1998 initial release of it. And then the further, it's been 25 years since that movie came out. And I think now that it's been a couple of decades since then, it's like, it was significant, but it wasn't, and it was never supposed to be Band of Brothers, which I think that's where people look at it.
Also, we haven't had any good D-Day movies. And so I think people don't have anything to contrast it with.
Yeah, for sure.
Because the closest thing is probably The Longest Day.
Yep.
But obviously, that's, 60 years old?
Yeah. 62 years old.
Yeah, and it covers such a wide topic that you can't focus on anything. So there's nothing to compare D-Day to. Yeah. So of course it's going to be Saving Private Ryan, sadly.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so that was our top 5 World War II movie list. So I hope people came away with a few movies they hadn't seen before and go watch them.
Yes.
I'll attach each of our lists in the description of whatever platform you're listening to this on. And thank you all for tuning in to World War II Above and Below. Sorry, still trying to get used to the new name. But Be sure to go follow us on Instagram and Spotify and subscribe to our YouTube channel. All you got to do is search for us through @WorldWar2 above and below. Links to those social media pages will also be in the description. So until next time, we'll see you guys later. Thanks for tuning in.
Yeah.